when you think about systemic racism, it's really about peeling back the layers of our systems and saying, we don't, we're seeing this race-based outcome and we're trying to understand how we got there and what we can do to rectify it. And it goes back to these foundations of the system. And if we're not honest about that and we don't actually look and think about why do we have certain rules that we have, and whether or not they have a connection to race-based control, then we're just doing ourselves a disservice in breaking free from that.
From the very moment a defendant is involved in this system, someone else has control over their story. They want to define that person solely by the crime they may have committed. You have a sentencing date set, and the stakes are high. Both lawyer and client need to do everything in their power to prepare. But the question is, are you ready? I'm Doug Passon. I'm a 25-year defense lawyer, a sentencing consultant, and an award-winning documentary filmmaker. In Set for Sentencing, I'm going across disciplines and outside the box to help both lawyer and client expand their perspective, build on their skills, and get real results in the form of significantly reduced sentences. All of this in service to one goal: to bring more fairness, more compassion, and more justice to the sentencing process. So, are you ready? Then let's get set for sentencing.
Hi, everybody. This is Doug Passon coming to you from Studio 3553 in Scottsdale, Arizona. Helping us get set for sentencing today, a very special guest I would like to welcome. Dean Jelani Jefferson-Exum. She is the Dean of the University of Detroit Mercy Law School. Her bio is long and impressive, so I'm going to just hit the highlights. But Harvard Law School grad and undergrad at Harvard, former law clerk in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals and the United States District Court, Eastern District of Louisiana, New Orleans native, law professor, and her research, her writing, her teachings are predominantly focused on sentencing issues, which is why I'm so excited to talk to Dean Jefferson-Exum. Now, she's this work in sentencing and her writing and her teaching really, I think, highlight sentencing and policing issues, but more specifically, systemic racial bias that are baked in the cake in these systems. And so she is dedicated to introducing new ways to think about the goals of our criminal justice system, and with the outcome to hopefully alleviate the consequences of those biases that are baked in the system. So welcome, Dean Jefferson-Exum. I'm so glad you're here. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you for having me. No, I'm excited about this.
Did I get everything right
in the... You did. That was a great introduction. Thanks so much. I appreciate it. You hit all the highlights. So thank you.
Awesome. So I think if I was going to break down the time that we're going to spend together, I would do it into two sections. One is sort of broad stroke analytical, dare I say theoretical, examinations about the bones of this system that we work in, how it's built, how it functions, or I guess more appropriately, the dysfunctions. And then I think the second aspect is going to be some hopefully really practical advice for lawyers and people who are listening on how we can what kind of changes are we looking to implement in the system to make it better, but B, how are we better players in the system? Either we're representing our clients or advocating in whatever way. So hopefully people are going to leave here with a really, really different and deeper perspective of our system, but also some really good practical tools to take away. So let's dig in. Wow, where to even start? I'll tell you where. I sent you this email this morning because I'm an avid reader of Berman's blog, and Professor Doug Berman has been on the podcast, and he always sends great information. And there was this article that was just a law review article just published from the Heritage Foundation that really seemed to basically be the polar opposite of everything that the work
Yeah.
that you're doing. And part of me was like, well, I'm going to just go through this point by point and we're going to refute it. But I was reading it and I was kind of getting so sick to my stomach that I figured I'm not even going to give it. But there are two things that I think were resonating in there that made me kind of upset, but I don't think they're specific to that. I think they're maybe permeate the zeitgeist in terms of misconceptions. And so I think it's a good place to start on systemic biases or systemic racism. The real sort of misconception is this idea that when you say critical race theory or systemic racism, that you're basically saying everybody's racist, the whole system's racist, everybody in the system's racist, black people are racist, white people are racist, and that's why it's broken. And I kind of don't think that's what you're talking about when you talk about it. So tell me, when you talk about systemic racism in the criminal justice system, what are we really talking about here?
Yeah, no, good question. Thanks for starting there. I will say I agree with the shout out for Professor Doug Berman's blog. He's a mentor of mine, friend. I love the work that he does, and it's a good blog to help you to stay on top of things. And so when you sent that article, I did give it a quick read, but like you, I couldn't dig fully in. I told myself maybe later, because there are some just key foundational points that that they start with that really miss the mark. And it really is just what you're hitting on, which is, what do we mean when we say systemic racism? So it doesn't require us to mean that every single person in a system is acting with racist motives, and that's why we have the outcomes that we have. The whole point of calling it systemic racism is that it's about systems and institutions. It does require us to kind of have a realistic, truthful understanding of the foundations of our system. And, let's go back to in American history. It's very hard to say that we don't have racism as the root of systems in our country. I mean, we have a country that started with having humans enslaved based on their race. That right there gives you a racist foundation. And so when you think about, I don't understand how anybody can refute. But when you start there, and then you say, okay, all of the modern institutions were built during a time when racism and race-based oppression was legalized, right? Legal and also supported in our Constitution, our court cases, legislation, and certainly in society, that it means that going forward, we have remnants of that. Right. So a lot of the disparities that we see today, we can trace them back to saying, okay, we can understand the way policing started. We can understand the way certain rights developed in the court system. We can understand, I mean, we're talking about criminal justice, but we could take this beyond to housing and education and all of that. That was our foundation, and we just have to be truthful about that. And so our job today is to say, okay, what are the remnants of our kind of racist foundations in this country? How have they been replicated, whether we meant to do it or not? In our systems, and how are we seeing those in our outcomes? So if we think about the criminal justice system, the fact that we have racial disparities at all in our criminal justice system, unless you're willing to say that because of your race, you're more inclined to criminal behavior, the fact that we have racial disparities at all when it comes to sentencing or punishment ought to give us pause to say, okay, we don't believe that, individuals are more inclined to criminalize behavior because of their race. Now, there's an aside here, which is there are people who do believe that, but I'm not talking about those people, right? Talking about others who say, no, that's not the reason. Then we have to peel away, okay, what is going on in various communities, and how has our legal system perpetuated injustices and oppression? And we see that throughout. We see it in the way we make decisions at policing stage, prosecution stage, sentencing stage. And so it's really about, when you think about systemic racism, it's really about peeling back the layers of our systems and saying, we're seeing this race-based outcome, and we're trying to understand how we got there and what we can do to rectify it.
So what would you say to somebody who says, okay, well, you started with slavery and that was a long time ago, and you're just living in the past, and what happened now 150 plus years ago is not relevant to today. The slaves were freed, we fought a war, we had the 13th Amendment, we had laws after Jim Crow. We've had the equal protection. We have all these great things that we've done to fix these problems. So why are we still talking about all this stuff that's ancient history?
Yeah, well, you just hit on some of them, which is that it's not really ancient history. You just gave a whole litany of things that had to be done that are pretty near to our current day. So yeah, slavery was a long time ago. That's true. And the end of slavery was a long time ago. But what happened after that? About 10 to 12 years of Reconstruction, followed by about 100 years of Jim Crow, which is, again, legally based, legally held up, race-based discrimination and oppression. And that is where we see the development of a lot, this is post 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. So the things that fix things, right? During that time is when we had cases like Plessy versus Ferguson saying that, separate but equal. So it's not enough to say that we've moved on from slavery. If we've had constitutional amendments that still allowed for interpretation to give room to racial segregation and to what ultimately has led to many of the disparities that we've seen now when we think about education and wealth, we're not that far away from it, right? And so even if we think about our own current generation, my parents grew up in segregation. That's not far. So if you think about, who influenced me and who influenced all of us who are alive now, we've been influenced by people who were living at a time where racism was explicitly in our laws. That's not a long time ago.
Yeah. I spend far too much time on the internet, but I just saw something about Ruby Bridges and like a current photo of her and the famous Norman Rockwell painting and yeah, she's alive and well.
Is alive.
I'm a fan of sort of pithy phrases and theory and theme and things like that, and people say you're living in the past, and I say no, I think the past is actually living in us still.
Love that. That's very true.
But let's give one specific example. When you say that the institutions were created in the wake of slavery, one obvious institution are police. When I look at the side of a police car and I see the old saying to serve and protect, my first question that I want to ask in my own head is who to serve and protect who? Can you talk about the origins of that and just trace the line from then to now?
Yeah. And so I wrote an article that is about this in a way. I've tried to use my sentencing research to connect it to policing and thinking about policing as acting as a form of punishment in many ways. And so I can talk more about that. But in one of my articles that is really following that line, I talk about how policing was developed in a way that certainly for Black Americans, the goal was control and keeping order. But we have to think about this being kind of Reconstruction era, post-slavery, and what did keeping order mean at the time? And so, you're thinking about, and I'm talking about, modern policing. And what it meant really was making sure that African Americans, newly freed, were not getting out of line. In whatever that meant to whatever those communities were that they were near. And so, it's interesting that there are texts, there's historical texts that really have very explicit language in them around the creation of certain police departments. And this also goes into militarizing, militias, so militarizing the citizenry, kind of arming the citizenry. And it was really to stop, revolution, to stop the hope for more expanded rights, amongst African Americans. And so just to give a real example of this, I talk about this in an article that's about being presumed punishable and how for African Americans, there's a long history of being presumed to not be innocent in spaces. And so if you think about early policing and having police forces that were meant to check to make sure that someone who's African American could actually be where they were. Some of this goes back into slave times as well. So show freedom papers. How are you here? Who is your owner? Right. So that it was all about controlling, and you're presumed to be punishable upon sight. The assumption is that you're not supposed to be here. The presumption is that you're not supposed to be here. That continued even into post-slavery. So if you think about the Reconstruction era, there were convict leasing systems. And the way that you found your way into a convict leasing system was to be Black person who was not employed, who couldn't show papers of employment, who couldn't show that you made a certain level of income, things like that. And so it's just, you found yourself face to face with police officers, not in the situation that we'd like to think of now, where the police were there to protect you, but the police were there to question why you were there and if it was okay for you to be where you were. For many Black Americans listening to this now, there are going to be things about that that still feel familiar in the neighborhoods that they're in. If they find themselves outside of their neighborhoods, this feeling of, am I being questioned about where I am? Now, I do want to say, because I think it's important to note that because we're talking about systemic issues, this is not an indictment of individual police officers across the board, right? And I think that's important. There are police officers that I've loved dearly, my grandfather and uncle, right? But even they would tell you there are things within our systems, things that we're asked to do that read to me as being very racially biased. And it goes back to these foundations of the system. And if we're not honest about that, and we don't actually look and think about why do we have certain rules that we have, and whether or not they have a connection to race-based control, then we're just doing ourselves a disservice in breaking free from that.
So you mentioned presumed punishable, and so I just want everybody to know there's a couple of really cool TEDx talks I'm going to put in the links to the show notes that you dig into this, and you have this concept of sentencing in the streets, which I thought kind of blew my mind, because what you're doing is drawing a straight line between police abuse and misconduct to the sentencing process, which is obviously what we're doing here. But the idea that when a police, and we just saw it this week, with that video from Alabama or Arkansas or whatever, that when police conduct themselves in that way, they're bypassing due process, and presumed that there's punishment that needs to be inflicted, sometimes the ultimate punishment. And we're still seeing it over and over and over again. I mean, I want to ask myself, when do I stop these when are these videos, I'm not going to have to see these anymore? And we still do. That's going to get us to defund the police, but I'm not there yet. But I'll tell you what, I mean, even in my, I spent the majority of my career in the federal system. And when you think about systemic, history still rearing its ugly head, the first thing, I'm in Arizona, and the two major kinds of cases we deal with here are crimes on the reservation, because we have a lot, huge amount of our state is Indian reservation, and immigration offenses. Well, guess what? The Supreme Court back in the 1800s says, no, we don't have jurisdiction over reservations. They're sovereign nation. And Congress didn't like that. So they passed the Major Crimes Act, which is so blatantly on its face unconstitutional. It's been held constitutional in Lomayama and other cases, but still, it's just so obvious that this is what was happening here. Was we looked at their system of justice, which was based more on restitution and maybe ostracization from the community, whatever it may be. And they said, no. This is how we do it, and you're going to do it our way. And as a consequence, we've scooped all these people into our system of justice, and we're dealing with that. And then the immigration stuff, I'm sure you're familiar. There's been now one case that said that this is the immigration law that targets primarily Latinx is racist, and it has racist origins, and it's unconstitutional. And every single day in court, I mean, that was the bulk of the cases that we saw, and we still see. And so we have now every day people in court where there's been at least one judge that says, look at the origins of this, it's racist. And we sentence as if to say, oops, okay, oh well. So I just think, anybody who says that, that all this is in the past, maybe just either needs a deeper perspective, or, they just don't see what we see sometimes.
Yeah.
Which is one of the reasons why I'm glad we're doing this, because this is about educating the public.
Absolutely.
And I'm so glad you said about the police. I'm not here to bash police. I'm the same way. I mean, I work with great law enforcement officers all of the time. all of the time.
Mhm.
And I feel really bad for them because the bad ones are screwing it up for the rest of them.
Yeah, it is. It's a hard, tough, it's a tough job. And it's hard to, when you see things to do things to correct when you're a police officer, because this is systemic, right? And so we have to have policies that change, we have to have approaches that change. I mean, thinking about my death penalty on the streets and sentencing on the streets work, they were really born of a desire to talk about things differently, so that in a way that I hoped would resonate with people in a different way, so that we could get out of just thinking about, oh, it's so sad that, we have another police killing, or the constant kind of back and forth about, well, did the person have their hands up or not have their hands up? Did they, should they have just complied with the police or not? All these kind of micro level discussion points, I thought, man, we're getting kind of tied up in things that really miss the bigger point, which is that shouldn't we all be able to live freely, assumed to be people who are not doing anything criminal? Shouldn't we be able to live with a trust level of police who are there to protect and serve? Shouldn't we be able to figure out ways to protect lives versus our first instance being, well, after the fact, here the list of things that they did wrong that they shouldn't have done, and if they hadn't done all those things, they wouldn't have been shot. I just wanted to back things up a bit, which was really why I thought about, in sentencing, at least, for all of the things about sentencing that need to be corrected. I certainly think that there's tons of things that we don't quite get right about sentencing, but when we think about just the ideals, right? When we think about sentencing ideals, this thought that Eighth Amendment says we are free from cruel and unusual punishment, that punishment can't be arbitrary, that it can't be disproportionate, that when it comes to the death penalty, it can't be an automatic penalty. There has to be some thought given to it. Like, all of that was meant for us to slow down, to assess, to think about what we're doing, and to make sure we're not going overboard. So those are the same problems that we're seeing in that day-to-day interaction between citizens and police officers, that we've bolstered up with a system that allows for it. And so, like you said, we think about the bad actors when it comes to police officers. Unfortunately, we have systems in place, we have procedures, from warrants, and the way warrants are I guess, I don't want to say, let me use the right word, the way warrants are processed, the way we, allow for policing levels in certain communities. All of that are systemic things that allow for the bad actor police officers to carry out the things that they do. And it makes it very difficult for police officers who want different outcomes to be able to push back against that.
Yeah, yeah. And we routinely get this question that seems difficult to answer sometimes, but it's really quite simple in my estimation, which is, well, is it, Occam's razor, the simplest explanation, which is, well, if the rates of incarceration are higher for African Americans, doesn't that just mean that they're committing more crimes? And I'll give you my answer, but yours is going to be much better than mine. But my response is, please look in my eyes and understand I am a criminal. I have committed more felonies than you care to count. And I won't go into specifics, but the simplest would be, well, let's just say hypothetically, if I would have enjoyed, say, some marijuana in Arizona before 2 years ago when it was made legal, that's a class 6 felony in the state of Arizona. And I think about growing up in a predominantly white suburb, when the only time I saw a black person was likely when they were pulled over driving through the main drag of town. And anytime I've had police encounters, it's been, okay, kids, go have a good night kind of deal. So there are a million ways things could have gone wrong for me had I been the focus of more intense policing in my lifetime.
Yes, no, I so appreciate that answer. It's what I tell my students. So I've taught for 15 years criminal procedure, criminal law, a course on sentencing, also a course on race and American law. I've taught constitutional law. In all of those classes, in some way, crime statistics come up. And I tell my students, crime statistics are not a measure of crime commission. Crime statistics are a measure of crime detection, which has everything to do with law enforcement priorities. So to say that, one group commits more crimes than another is really just saying is not really comparing their, fullness of their lives and everything that's happening. What we're saying is that when law enforcement is focused in this one area on these specific crimes, then we see this imbalance. I think the drug example is right on, is spot on, because that's a place that's an easy one to talk about racial disparities. And we have statistics now that show us how out of whack arrests for drugs, prosecutions for drugs by race are when you compare it to actual use and sale of drugs across race. People across races use and sell pretty much every type of drug at just about the same rate. But when you look at, especially local levels, arrests, drug prosecutions, the rate of arrests and prosecutions of Blacks in pretty much across the board, and in some places, Hispanic, Latinx communities, is through the roof compared to whites. And that it does not at all match up with the reality of people's behaviors. Right. And so then this goes back to the systemic racism. Then you have to ask yourself, well, why is this so? If I have statistics now, I like to, in my work, call it bias bolstering versus bias revealing statistics. The crime statistics on their own are bias bolstering because they support that view that, oh, well, Blacks commit more crime. The bias revealing statistics about use and sale by race, and when we look at things like people who are sentenced for the same types of crimes, but you see a disparity based on race, that Blacks are sentenced more harshly for the same types of crimes than whites. Those are our bias revealing statistics. They tell us something funny is happening here. And you have to stop and say, well, what is that about? That's what systemic racism, that's an example of it. It's showing you that when our outcomes are such that they're not matching up to the reality, then there's something else here. And it doesn't require us saying an individual person is, masterminding all of this and with their, supreme racism, but it's just understanding that, like, okay, we should stop and back up and think, how can we be fairer? How can we be more equitable? What are the pieces of our system that are causing us to have these outcomes? And how do we intervene there?
And I do think there's a cultural element to it in the sense that bias happens when you're sort of not really, when you're kind of just living on autopilot and not real. What I'm trying to say is, if you look at the portrayals that we see in the media all the time, on the evening news, what stories they choose to print, on pop culture and everything else, combined with the fact that many people, myself included, grew up without ever being around a Black person.
Mm-hmm.
And so until you actually, and this goes back to my main thing, which is empathy, this idea that we have to be able to connect with other human beings and see the world through their eyes. But if you don't know any, that's not possible.
Right.
It was college before I began to build those relationships, which is another whole other side topic, because, if you go to college these days, you're just an elite and it's a waste of time and it's a waste of money. No, you get to actually experience new ideas and new people and maybe broaden your mind a little bit. But I think that the broadening your mind aspect is really a key component to this. But I veered off into another lane. Bring it back to drugs, because you've written on this too. We have another new drug problem, which is the opioid epidemic, and it doesn't seem to be getting the same treatment as prior so-called drug epidemics. What's going on there?
Yeah, I think your point really isn't a tangent at all, right? Because it's all about the same thing. It's bias, and bias affects all of us. And unfortunately, anti-Black bias affects all of us, and many studies to show this. And it's about the images that we have in the media. It's about just the way we go out about in the world and talk and what we see, and even the disparities in incarceration feed into that bias. The more that we are used to having Black and brown people caught up in the criminal justice system, the easier it is to see people in that light. And that's exactly what we see at play in kind of that distinction between this opioid crisis versus war on drugs and the crack, so-called crack epidemic, where the images that came from the crack epidemic were so racialized. And there was this view of crack being something that was ravaging the kind of poor Black neighborhoods. And this is not to say that there weren't real significant drug problems. It's just the fact that it was cast in such it's them, it's their problem, but it causes danger to us. And so we must use the criminal justice system to protect ourselves in a war, right? Even using the war language requires an enemy. And the enemy wasn't the inanimate drugs. It was the drug dealers and the drug addicts who are going to rob you, the drug dealers who are going to shoot you. And those people were Black people in every depiction and continue to be. I mean, I think about movies that I watched growing up that are about, 80s, 90s, anything having to do with drugs, it's Black drug dealers, right? And so that's what we saw. Opioid crisis shifts the lens and the depiction of the people who are affected, both, by the way, those who are suffering from any kind of substance abuse, right? Because they are the neighbors around us. They're white families that are being affected. But even it's been difficult to identify, the drug dealers, the street drug dealers that we, saw. Those are bad guys for certain. We've had some difficulty thinking about, is it, the doctors, the pharmaceutical companies, so there's not the same thinking that we're now in a war where we have to have a weapon. In the war on drugs, it was mandatory minimum sentencing. That's what we were going to aim at people. It's this increased police force, and we're going to put them away for a long time. Now we've shifted to, I mean, I think it's a good shift. It's just one that's very, very different. To thinking about community care, thinking about programs to help with substance abuse and misuse. It's still not perfect. There are a lot of places where we still need to do a lot more work, but the tone of conversations have changed. And that, if we ask ourselves, well, what's different in the pictures, maybe we could say we've learned more. Since the 80s, 90s, we've become more sophisticated in our understanding about drugs. The only problem is that we still have crack and powder cocaine disparities in our laws. So it's like, we've learned, but we haven't applied it to the places where we have all of these disparities are not in the same way. So then, what else has changed is that it's different communities being affected, namely white communities. And so there's a different level of attention that's being given. I think those are things that we just have to be honest about. So that if you are the type of person who says, oh, whoa, when I look at it that way, that doesn't seem right at all, that's not what I want to be a part of, then we can have conversations about what we might need to be in place to rectify that. And, if you're not that type of person, it'll be hard to have a conversation with you anyway about any of this. But the hope is to capture folks who are really intend to have equitable systems, and maybe just need to have a little bit more information about, drawing out these distinctions.
Yeah. And if I can bring it back to the empathy idea and the opioids, it's I know someone in my life who's been affected.
That's exactly.
This could be my story.
That's exactly what it is.
Someone I love.
Yeah. And I mean, it's a fact of being a racial minority in a country. It means that you have to wait for a majority to care about you in the same way that they care about people who look like them. And to your point about, going to college and that being the first time of having like exposure to other cultures, that still happens today. And it's a good thing to have people to come together, to be able to learn from one another. It does help to alleviate bias. The unfortunate part is that doesn't happen across the nation. And the real lived experience of people who are, racial minorities in this country, or who have been subject to oppression in this country, is that we don't have the luxury of waiting for somebody to go to college and finally meet one of us and then say, oh, now I understand you better, right? We don't have that luxury. And so we have to work for systemic change, and change that will get around bias, because it exists and it's going to continue in some form. And so that's what I try to do in my work, is think about the fact that the bias is there, and that it's eradicated so slowly and at such an individual level that, what do we do in the meantime to protect people? How can we think about policing differently? How can we make connections between policing and sentencing? How can we be truthful to a presumption of innocence for groups of people who have been presumed punishable? What are things that we can do in our systems to try to make life, livable while we wait for folks to start to kind
get
of
to college.
yeah, to get to college. So
That's a great segue, because that's exactly where I wanted to go next, was, this idea of policing and how do we, fix this problem. And so we're gonna hit defund the police, which in the Heritage Foundation article, sorry to go back to it, they do that with an exclamation
I
point.
know.
This is a
They're all
hysterical
yelling it.
screed. Now, I do say, since I am the wordsmith messaging storytelling guy, I don't like the term defund the police, because I think it gives up control of the narrative. And controlling the narrative is key in what we do. And what it does, it gives the other side fodder to misrepresent what we're talking about. And I'll just quote from the Heritage Foundation, because this is what defund the police means to them. It means, quote, "We should completely abandon all federal, state, and local law enforcement efforts to protect the community against violent criminals and drug traffickers."
Right. Right.
Is that what defund the police means, Dean Jefferson-Exum?
It's not. It's not. And I think they also know it's not, right? It's using the term and catching up all the feelings around the term, and then using it against its actual intentions. Like the call to defund the police. And I have to say, I didn't come up with the phraseology and all that, so but I respect people who are community activists who are working to make change. And so the terms come out of these movements, and I think it is incumbent upon all of us to talk about them and their intentions honestly. And so when we think about defund the police, the goal is to think about the reallocation of resources so that we are putting resources in the places that really make communities safest, that really build up trust in communities. And so the call is to not just continue to pour money in the same way into police departments, meaning having them sort of continue to operate in the way that they do with funds from the militarization of police that we've seen over time, to having increased police sort of in certain communities, to increasing drug enforcement agencies and their ability and authority to go into neighborhoods. Defund the police is saying, can we step back, think about where communities actually need police presence and support, and where they need other services. So what about incorporating mental health experts? What about incorporating the support for community services that may help people in crisis? What about giving people, there's another concept that I like called unbundling the police. And so this may be one to look into and for people to dig into a little bit more. And this is pulling apart police functions so that we actually have non-police agencies to turn to in certain instances. So I'll give you one, like a famous example, which would be George Floyd's murder, right? That if we think about the story there, and I know you're into storytelling, Doug, so and I am too. I teach through stories all the time. But if you think about the story there, this is not just a story of police officers who assaulted someone, knelt on his neck, ultimately killed him before video and captured for all of us to see. That's the end of it. Go back to the beginning of the story. This is about a man who goes into a store, who is suspected of having a false $20 bill. We can think about other ways than calling the police for that type of situation, right? Could there be someplace else that this is reported that follows up? This is, most people are returning to places in their communities. He wasn't someone who was going to, get into a car, ride off into the sunset, and we never know where this fake $20 bill came from. Are there other ways for businesses to deal with potential fraud? Does this even have to be something that results in kind of your police force, your on the street police force interacting with an individual in a way that could end up becoming hostile? And so unbundling the police is thinking about our traditional police functions, the fact that if anything happens, we just call 911. We don't have other places to call. Can we rethink policing so that we unbundle their current functions and put some of these functions elsewhere, places that don't end up with police interaction? And so I really like that concept, and it's one that I've explored a bit more as well in some of my work. It's not my coin term, but others have talked about this. So in any case, the overall point, I know I talked a long time to your
No, I think that's very enlightening as to the truth of what we're talking about here. The problem is reallocation of resources isn't quite as sexy as defund or unbundling. I was doing some brainstorming. One is borrowing a patently ridiculous phrase that the right is using in healthcare, which is repeal and replace, even though that's a whole other story about their true intent. But maybe that's what we're talking about. We need police, and we need these other professionals, mental health professionals. But whatever's happening right now is not right. There's also, I'm thinking of an old program here. I don't know if it still goes on. They call it Weed and Seed, which I think is kind of apropos. And in terms of resources, I can't help but think about a proactive allocation of proactive resources, because we always have an unlimited pot of money when it comes to police, prosecutors, defense lawyers, prisons, never a shortage of prison beds. But if we reallocated some of those resources to, I don't know, Head Start, really meaningful drug treatment programs, job training, free community college, blah, blah, blah. It'd be a very different America, I think, that we're living into.
It's really just about not having the police be the answer for all the ills.
Right. And I don't think they want to be the answer for all the ills either. I really don't.
It's not a great use of their time. And it's also not safe for police officers either, if they're in situations that are not the ones that they're necessarily trained for, or the ones that they have the right tools to approach. It's not safe for them either. So, this is really just about rethinking public safety and bringing in community needs as a perspective there.
All right, let's talk about the word anti-racism. What is it, and how do I get there?
Good questions. I'll say I didn't come up with the term, so what I say it is might be different again from its original intent. But just if you take the word itself, anti-racism, so being against racism, right? But so it requires us to understand what we're talking about by racism. And anti-racism really is meant to address systemic institutional racism. You may have Ibram Kendi might say, it goes deeper into personal racism as well. But the thinking is that to the extent that we know that there are disproportionate outcomes in whatever system, but let's talk about criminal justice system, right? So disproportionate outcomes in arrest rates and in prosecution rates and in, incarceration rates, and that we see a racialized outcome there, that if we acknowledge that to be tied to systemic racism, being anti-racist means to work towards systems that will reverse those effects, that will address those effects. It is an active term, right? So you can't be passively anti-racism. That anti-racist, that doesn't work, right? Because then you're just allowing the racism that's already in systems to continue. So to be anti-racist, you have to actively look for solutions to the race-based outcomes in systems. And depending on the system that you're talking about, the approach is going to be different. The criminal justice system has huge racialized outcomes in so many ways that it has to have a multifaceted anti-racism approach. But when I think about it in my own work, I just think about, looking at any place where we see these outcomes and thinking, not just what's the cause, because we know individual bias plays in, we've talked about that, but systemically, what is the thing in our system? What's the law? What's the regulation? What's the practice? What's the policy that's allowing for this outcome? And how do we come up with a different one that still gets us the protection, the goals that we want, without the racist outcome? That's it.
That seems very difficult, especially in a situation where, for me, for example, if I am going to point out what I think are racist elements in the system, there's an immediate knee-jerk reaction to recoil and be defensive and say, well, I'm not racist. How dare you? Even, like, give me some, just, I don't know, like, is there any way to kind of get into that without like just automatically having the wall come down and people be shut off to
I
what you're
mean,
trying to do?
the more you take it away from the individualized racism, I think the more it goes across, but it's difficult to do. I'll give you an example. And I mean, the truth is racism is uncomfortable. As a Black woman who's experienced racism in different ways in my life, um, I have perhaps less concern about the discomfort that one might feel in me trying to have a conversation about racism in a, calm, reasonable way. To have someone say, well, that makes me feel uncomfortable. Okay, that's just what it is. And so for me, I think the discomfort is just a part of it. And we just have to, we just push through that. But to give an example, let's think about sentencing and disparate sentencing outcomes. So we imagine there's a judge, imposing sentencing. So we're not talking about, mandatory minimums and, because those already have their own systemic issues. But we're just talking about the decision that judges have made from case to case to case. And let's say that particular judge, when we look at their sentencing outcomes for similar cases, we are seeing that Black and Brown defendants are being sentenced more harshly than white defendants. Let's say that's the outcome. Rather than having to leave it to individual defense attorneys to say, hey, judge, did you notice that you have this, kind of race-based outcome in your sentencing, and the judge to recoil in the way that you said, to say like, well, I'm not racist. It's to institute procedures that allow or that require judges to look at this. So it doesn't have to be, judge, we think you're racist. It can be systemically, we see that we have these outcomes, and so we'll put into place. This can come through lots of different ways. And I, have different thoughts on what's the best way to require this. But having requirements of periodic review of the outcomes and sentences across districts or circuits, if we will. I'm talking kind of federal level, but this can be replicated on the state level, where we are actually very honest about outcomes and show it, put it out there. Hey, there are these differences in different courts, and then have courts talk through plans to address. This is similar to what we do. I tried to compare it to other areas of inequity. So like pay inequity, how do you deal with the fact that women systemically are paid less than men in the workplace? What's been done to address that is transparency in pay, showing what people are paid, and then having to say like, oh, you know what, there are these disparities. Let's think about what we have to do to equalize these. There's resistance to do that in sentencing because we talk about sentencing as so individualized that, yeah, maybe you see this handful of cases where Black defendants were sentenced more harshly than white defendants for the same types of crimes. But, we can't make things too uniform because there has to be individualized sentencing, and judges have to be able to take into account lots of different things about background. Okay, but I think we have to just confront the fact that some of the things about background might be things that have nothing to do with goals of punishment, and that really, because of our society, are going to be proxies for race. And we're punishing people more harshly because of the neighborhood that they grew up in, or the lack of educational opportunities, or you don't have as much family support as another defendant. But in our society, that all ends up being proxies for race in certain communities. And so we just have to say, look at it, look at the numbers, and require judges to do that, and then say you can't actually do that. Your outcomes are disparate. You have to make adjustments.
And I think about Ibram Kendi, Professor Ibram Kendi, who described anti-racism, as you put in your article, as a radical choice in the face of this history, requiring a radical reorientation of our consciousness. And I feel like maybe there's the keys to the kingdom are in those words about our consciousness, because it goes back to what we see, what we notice, what we pay attention to, and I think in my experience, especially in federal court, judges are well-meaning, well-intentioned, generally very, very intelligent people whose main goal is to do the right thing. It's just they don't necessarily know what the right thing is. And I say that's our job. That's our job, to sort of help them. And I go back to the immigration thing. So there's one court that said this is racist law, and we're sentencing every day. Well, guess what? We can't challenge that law because it's a fast track system. They're shuffling these people through, so they have to take pleas. Otherwise, they're going to get much more time. But when you talk about the goals of sentencing and the history and characteristics, another goal of sentencing that's right there in 3553 is this outcome going to promote respect for the system? And I think, look at those lawyers, look at those goals of sentencing and see where you can make a reasonable, credible, maybe subtle, but, not a beat you over the head argument to say, Judge, how, is there an argument that when we are sentencing someone for a crime that at least one court right up the road has said is unconstitutional with a discriminatory bias, origin, and intent, that people are going to view what we're doing here and bring ill repute to our system, and that maybe we do need to rethink this? And I don't think it's going to happen overnight and go, oh yeah, counsel, you're right, time served and move on. But we got to keep saying the words.
Yeah. No, I agree. I agree with you that, I've done projects where I've gone across the country, interviewed federal district judges about how they sentence, why they sentence the way they do. And across the board, judges were very thoughtful. They cared, they wanted to do the right thing. But there was an information gap. And I'll tell you, so I've listened to some of your past podcasts. I know that you ask people about origin stories. I have one for you.
Oh,
if
good.
you don't, if you don't mind.
Please.
I had thought of a couple that I could have given you, but one that's about why I was interested in being a lawyer, but this one is about how I got interested in sentencing and sentencing work. So it was when I was clerking on the Eastern District Court of Louisiana, and when I started clerking, the federal sentencing guidelines were mandatory. So when every other week when we had our sentencing days, defendant after defendant will come through, I would have helped the judge to prepare the sentencing script, which basically was plugging in some information that was already in our pre-sentence report, already calculated the guidelines, and then just spit out what the guideline range would be. And so I would write up what the judge was going to say, usually something about respect for the law and, kind of going through things, something about the offense, and then ending with the actual sentence. And my particular judge, he would usually ask me, he tended to sentence toward the lower end of the guideline range. He'd usually ask me, is there something in the file that would, push me higher up, let me know if there's something like that. And there usually wasn't. There were, a lot of run-of-the-mill cases. And so we plug in kind of the lower number of the range. Well, the experience of sitting in front of, in court, again, Black woman in Louisiana, judge was white, other law clerks white, the court reporter was white. Sometimes the bailiff was Black. It was a change, but mostly the front was white people except for me. And defendants, by and large, were young Black men coming in, mostly drug cases. And so they would lock eyes with me. And, I would see them and I know what's coming. I know exactly what the judge is going to say. I put my head down, we're reading. I didn't know if I should give them, a heads up on, not looking good or, you're going to be okay. I don't know, but they looked at me as though they were looking for some sort of indication of something, like I was the one they connected with. So that always stayed with me. And then halfway through my clerkship, United States v. Booker was decided. And so right in the middle, 6 months in, federal sentencing guidelines are now advisory. And I thought, oh, wow, because I talked to my judge about, he would say he was bound by these guidelines, but there were times when he wanted to do something different. And I thought, now's the chance, we're going to do all these different inventive, sentencing approaches. And by and large, we continue to stay within guideline sentences. And so I left with this big question of why. And and I will tell you, my judge is an awesome person, really cared. So this is no fault of him. It's just that what other information did he have to do anything different? There were, and now I know that many judges have started to depart more from the sentencing guidelines as attorneys have stepped in to really talk more about those 3553A factors, humanize defendants in different ways, propose different punishments. But for judges who came up with the guidelines, what else do you do if somebody isn't explaining what some other options are in this case that give you some feeling that, oh, the things that I actually care about, recidivism, violence, the plan for the defendant, someone is bringing this to my attention and helping me to match this to a sentence that is appropriate. So that's why I cared about this work in the beginning, was just to say, like, can I help in my career to figure out ways to talk to judges, ways to talk to attorneys about how to fill those gaps? What are we doing? What is the point? What are we trying to accomplish? Can we talk about punishment in that way when we're figuring out this number? But ultimately, hopefully it comes back to us seeing that, like, oh, incarceration doesn't do much of this at all. So we should be doing some other things. But that's my hopefully not too long
That's a
sentencing scholar origin story.
great origin story. And it really makes me think, just stories about the guidelines in general. So the sentencing guidelines ostensibly are, there's an anti-racist maybe motive in creating them, supposedly, because the idea is before the guidelines, judge could sentence you to whatever up to the stat max. There was no guidance, and that really could lead to some disastrous results in when there really is racist decision making going on. So the idea was treat everybody the same, and then nobody can get outside the guidelines. Now, interestingly, before Booker, the first sort of crack in the door was, well, now we can depart a little bit more when the cases are quote unquote outside the heartland. But ironically, I was a law student. This is one of my origin stories. I was a law student at the time, and I was in moot court, and we went to DC for some moot court thing, and we got to go see oral arguments at the Supreme Court.
Oh, wow.
And it just so happened that one of the oral arguments I got to see in 1995 or 6 was United States versus Coons, Stacey Coons, who, maybe some of our listeners are too young to remember that, but white police officer, the first really sensationalized videotape beating. Horrible beating of a black motorist, Rodney King. And this white officer gets charged federally with civil rights violation. He goes, no, these guys, I don't want to go to jail for that long. I'm a police officer. If I go to jail, I'm in big trouble. And all of a sudden it was, maybe we should be, deviating from these guidelines more. So I always thought that was a real interesting history. I'm super glad when Booker came down and the guidelines became discretionary. It gives us power. It gives the judges power. And I think most judges, good, well-intentioned judges, want that power, and they use it wisely.
Yeah, agreed. And I mean, your point about the origins of the guidelines being anti-racist in a way. I mean, it goes back
generous,
to what we were talking about before. Yeah, no, but I mean, there's I agree with that in some way. But you said a while back that my definition of anti-racism, you said, well, that's a big job. It's hard to do something like that. And it just is a reminder that anti-racism work requires us to be constantly evolving and evaluating. So yes, the guidelines were developed to try to bring some uniformity, but as they went on and as they were ratcheted up based on sort of political will, and as they had to go up because of mandatory minimums that had this race-based effect and all of that, we have to reassess. Okay, they're not fulfilling the anti-racism goals anymore, and we have to change and adapt. So being anti-racist is never, it never has just an end like, "Ooh, we've done that, we fixed that one." Right? It's about being reflective. It's about being intentional.
Yeah, and I'll give you one more origin story on reflective and intentional, because, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about sentencing. But I think about when I was a baby federal defender, and it was maybe my first day, and I had a great mentor, and he's now a Superior Court judge, but a good friend and just a solid human being. And he was taking me to court and showing me the ropes. So we went to initial appearances at 3:00 when all the new arrestees are led into the courtroom, and they're handcuffed together, shackled together, and they're in the jury box. And this lawyer stood up when it was time to announce, and he announced, on behalf of the defense. And he said to the judge, the magistrate judge, "I just would like the court to take judicial notice that every single person in this jury box today is either black or brown. And the judge didn't know what to do with that. And I was like, well, that's interesting. And, I'm sure there are people that maybe heard that and saw that and rolled their eyes and said, okay, you can get off your soapbox now. But when I look back on that moment, this gentleman was telling me, A, you need to pay attention. Just look for a second and what's happening. And then B, you need to speak the truth.
Right.
So I think maybe that's the key.
Yeah.
Pay attention and speak your truth.
Yeah, I'll add a C to that. After you pay attention and you speak your truth, then you have to think about ways to rectify. It's not enough to for us to call things out if we haven't thought about what's that next step. How do we fix it? How do we change things so that this is avoided? How do we change things so that this isn't what people's experiences are?
Thank you for that. And I love my threes, so that's perfect. I'm
Yeah,
glad we had a C.
There you go.
Oh, I love it. And I feel like we should end there, but I'm not going to, because you have this great, like I said, we want practical advice. And you have this great article that may be a book someday, I'm hearing, but it's called Guidance to the Guidelines, where you interviewed federal judges all over about what's behind their sentencing decisions. And I think it'd be great information for defense lawyers to just give us some bullet points about what matters to the judges and what moves the needle.
Yeah, judges, it was really eye-opening, because this was judges from, judges with many different backgrounds. So some who were appointed by Republican presidents, some Democratic presidents, judges who had been on the bench for a long time, some who were pretty new. But by and large, there were a few themes that came up for judges regularly. And when it came to the guidelines, one is that judges wanted to know what went into this guideline calculation. And so they wanted to know why are these numbers what they are? And I thought, there's a great opportunity for the Sentencing Commission to give more information there. But until it does, right, this is a place for lawyers to step in. It really works, I think, very well for the defense side of things, because often what you can say, what went into these numbers? Well, there was a congressional amendment that was a response to this thing that has nothing to do with this case, right? That added these numbers. And so if we took those things out, here's where this case would actually be, right? If you have a judge who wants to still talk in numbers. So that's one thing, explaining how the information that went into the guidelines is not relevant to the case in front of the judge. So disregard, don't think about this. It doesn't have anything to do with the things that you care about. What does the judge care about? There were a few themes that came out quite often. One was, what you might expect. So like a history of violence. Judges wanted to know what to do with that. So I think if you have a situation, it's easier for prosecutors to look at at criminal history and to explain that as something that ought to be very significant in a case. For defense attorneys, you have the harder job, but know that that's what judges care about. So distancing your clients from that history, explaining what they're doing now, right? These are things that resonate. And then it goes back to that first point, which is, again, why the numbers that you have in front of you really don't have anything to do with this case. Here's how my client has addressed any sort of issues of violence in his or her record. And then, this came up. I was an expert witness in a case dealing with child pornography possession. And my job really was to be on the stand and to explain to the judge how the sentencing guidelines for child pornography possession got to be where they are. So it was a lot of explaining away the need to follow them. That's really what I was being used for as an expert. And what the judge cared about in that case was in that particular case, it was about maybe, would this defendant harm children? But if we take that to broader cases, it's about this risk of recidivism. So these are the things that judges tell me keep them up at night, right? Which is, am I going to make a choice that's going to end up leading to, harm to others? And you can think about, especially if you're thinking about this from the defense standpoint, if that's what's on a judge's mind, then it's much easier to impose incarceration. because that helps you to feel like, oh, well, at least the person will be away for a while, right? So, but that's not really what they want to do. What they really want to do is feel comfortable that a decision that is either less incarceration or a non-incarcerative sentence is still okay for this defendant. That's what they really want to know. And that's what attorneys have to do. And I've been saying, prosecution versus defense. The truth is that prosecutors can do this too. Prosecutors should be seeking the sentence that is really fitting for a case, not going above what's necessary. And so it's important for prosecutors to do this as well, really thinking about how to ease that fear, that concern that judges have, that they'll do something that leads to, headlines. That's what they're concerned about, not just because of the publicity, but because of the real concern about people and safety. Those things came up over and over again. There were lots of judges who, didn't like guidelines. Some felt comfortable with guidelines. So they were across the board, but they all cared about, how do I know if I'm making the right decision for this defendant, right? And what's in these guidelines anyway?
Good. Well, I think I'm going to put something in the show notes. We call that in our world deconstructing the guidelines. So there's actually been a lot of great research and writing about what went into these guidelines and how detached they are from the reality of case. And of course, that was central in Justice Jackson's confirmation hearing too, specifically those child porn guidelines, and I don't remember which judge says, I wish I could quote them, but they said basically they want to know, is this a case where I'm going to be mad at you or scared of you? And that's sort of hit what you're saying. I think this idea of, you broke the law, so I'm going to be mad, I'm going to have to punish you, but I don't want to be afraid that you're
and just one other point that came to mind that was interesting is that judges don't get a lot of feedback on the effectiveness of their sentences. You sentence, you move on to the next case. And the judges who I interviewed had different feelings about whether they wanted more information or not. Would it be helpful? Some said, that's for, another part of the process, Bureau of Prisons and, stuff like that. And then some said, I would want to know because I don't have a good sense of whether the sentences I'm imposing are really getting to those goals that I have in mind. I don't know if this amount, this length of a prison sentence, does it do anything? Does it, and is it longer than necessary? There's a judge, Judge Bennett, who he did a project where he went back and interviewed people who he sentenced. And many of them told him, and this wasn't scientific research, it's anecdotal, but people who had long sentences told him, my first year, I was, angry, upset that I was in here. A couple years in, I started to kind of just accept that this is what's happening. Maybe by year, 3 or 4, I'm like, thinking about ways that I want to improve myself, something like that. But these are people there for a long time. By year, 10, 15, I'm like, this is all pointless. You have wasted time. Like, I don't need to still be here, but judges don't get that kind of information. And so to have groups that study that work on, that think about the effectiveness of sentencing and give that information back around to judges, that would be super, super useful. And many judges, I believe, would be very open to that.
And that's a good reminder. I got to get Judge Bennett on this podcast.
Awesome.
Yes, if you're listening, he's not. Come on my podcast. No, I'm going to reach out to him. But that is that's amazing advice. And as far as the criminal history stuff goes, that is the go-to move from the prosecutors. Stand up and read all the times a person's been in trouble, like as if the judge couldn't read that themselves. But a lot of lawyers don't really want to touch that because they don't know what to do with it. But as you mentioned, the proximity of this offense, maybe there's long gaps in time where they haven't been in trouble. And I want to know, tell me that story. What was going right for them that allowed them 5 years of zero contact with the criminal justice system? And what happened that they're back here now? Or, this entry in your past looks really awful. Well, you better dig into that because I want to know, was there really a very little evidence, but it was one of those deals where they're sitting in jail and they were offered a sweetheart probation plea, so they just pled guilty because we have coercive plea bargaining in our system? And that, come on, let's tell these stories. Did we miss any big points of from that article that you that you can recall? Or
I don't think so. As you said, it
okay,
was supposed to be preliminary, book to
yeah,
come.
good.
Don't hold your breath, but I've worked on lots of other projects in the meantime, including, being dean of a school and all. So
Nice, nice, nice. Well, my colleague Alan Ellis did something similar and wrote these articles on Law 360 called "A View from the Bench." And the good news is we're gonna do this together soon. So that will be to be continued.
nice.
And like I said, I'm gonna put some of your articles, your amazing TEDx talks in the show notes.
Yeah.
Excuse me. But I would just love to know. So you mentioned you've been an expert witness in cases, so that anybody who's listening, please understand that you have a fantastic resource with Dean
Thank you.
Jefferson-Exum. If you need somebody to talk about what origins of the guidelines, deconstruction issues, racial bias issues, all of it,
Covered
right?
it.
Okay,
Absolutely. Yeah.
good. So her information will obviously be in the show notes. What else should I got anything good happening? Articles coming out, books coming out, plug the law school. What should we
I
what should
do.
we say?
I always have to plug my law school. So I'm dean of University of Detroit Mercy School of Law. I'll just tell you quickly the reason why I'm here. I joined the faculty here in 2019, but because it's a school that is focused on social justice and really graduating students who don't just want to be lawyers, but they want to be lawyers who have an impact on their community. So I knew that this school would support the type of work that I did. And as dean, I've really tried to grow our programs and give resources to our students to do that. So for those of you out there, you're listening, you're thinking about law school, Detroit Mercy Law is a great place to get real experience. All of our students will represent real clients in our clinical program. It's a graduation requirement and a real perspective on how the law impacts the community around you and what you can do to be a positive force there. And so, I've stayed with even as dean with my research. I have a recent article out called "Where Black Lives Matter Less," and it's going through some data from the Texas system and death penalty, and really digging into the fact that even for a type of sentencing that's meant to say, "Hey, we are recognizing," the taking of life and saying a death penalty, our ultimate punishment, is going to show adequate retribution for this act, that if it's a Black life that's taken, we don't get the death penalty as often. I'm not a proponent of the death penalty. In fact, it's an abolitionist article, but it's showing that we have these baked in inequities in our systems that sometimes can't be rectified because of our history. And in those cases, they do too much damage and they're irreversible, and that we ought to not have them at all. So that's what I'm working on, and continuing to just think about how we can promote people being able to live freely and with humanity and respect for their humanity and with safety. That's my ultimate desire. And it shouldn't matter what your background is, your race, your religion, your sexual orientation, your gender identity. We all ought to be able to have that freedom. And so whatever I can do to help with those discussions, that's what I'm here for.
That's amazing. Wow. All right. Well, thank you so much for being here, but more importantly, for your work and for your voice, for your dedication to making the system more fair, more humane.
Appreciate it.
I had a really fun time with you today, so thank you so much, and come back soon.
I'd love to. Thanks for having me.
That's it for today, but before we go, I just wanted to take a moment and say thank you to you, the listener, for spending time with us today getting set for sentencing. Whether you're a lawyer, someone who could use the help, or maybe you're just a true crime buff who loves the inside scoop on how this whole thing works, I am so glad you're here, and I hope you keep listening. If you like the podcast, please do me a favor. Spread the word about Set for Sentencing and give us a rating and review on the iTunes podcast platform. It would really help. Last but not least, if you're interested in knowing more about what I do, mitigation videos, case consults, live teaching, on-demand educational content, books, articles, all of it, please visit www.dougpasson.com.
law.com. I'm Doug Passon. Until next time, hang in there. Wait a minute, that's a stupid way to sign off a podcast about sentencing. Hang in there. What's the matter with you, man? I guess they call that gallows humor. Sorry. All right. Well, I will see you next time on Set for Sentencing. Bye-bye.